Indeed.
Hi,
And
everybody,
I'm
and welcome to the Cultural Studies podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is
Deb Merskin, and in the field behind me in my background is a horse who is outstanding in their field.
outstanding in their field. Does the horse that is outstanding in the field have a name?
I do not know this one horse in particular. In fact, some of them get rotated in and out of this field because they are representative of, which is curiously already onto some of my work, what this particular piece of property in real estate wants to represent about itself as a destination. So I call them the decorative horses.
The decorative horses. So is this folks who are put out to stud or under agistment or one of those charming?
Probably all of the above.
Uh-huh.
They also have a stable here, and horses are ridden. Some horses are retired, and so they circulate a few in and out of the front field where they graze comfortably in the midst of the high sun without very much shade, but at least they provide a lovely entree to a place that is a beautiful resort that calls itself a ranch. So that provides a nice you'll have a few things, a few random cowboy hats, a few lassos, a bits of barbed wire, and a couple of horses to set the stage.
This sounds like that old line from a Steely Dan song, "The Dude Ranch Above the Sea."
Yes,
In,
indeed.
in any event, Prof, the thing I normally do, as I explain to you to kick things off, is to ask about what's currently impeding, demoralizing, dynamizing, preoccupying, interesting you. What's going on? What matters?
What matters? I think so much matters, but I guess to put it into something that my little mind can get around sometimes is since air quotes retiring early and maybe earlier than I would have preferred, but from the traditional academic life, part of my motivation was I wanted to walk the talk of what I was doing, which was writing about, researching, making arguments for, I would have to say, an aside, everything that's now being prohibited in terms of being taught in the American education system, which is the history, the context of those who may not have voices, those who may be invisible, those who may not be heard, and trying to. So I started out with human beings in that regard. And
Mhm.
then as time went on, it became increasingly clear to me that animals other than humans may, in fact, have the least representation, the fewest allies in terms of their perspectives, and
Mhm.
that they have them. So in moving from Eugene, Oregon to Central Oregon, and this is kind of a long answer here, but I started to walk the talk in terms of my research related to animals who are marginalized in the wild. And then hands-on for the last 5 years, I've been in the Wildlife Rescue and Rehabilitation Hospital here in Central Oregon. Everything is glamorous as cleaning up raccoon poop and then hand feeding baby birds and holding raptors who are being treated, who were injured or orphaned because of what we humans do, and seeing the effects on our wildlife of um, human laws, rules. Certain animals can be cared for, certain cannot because they're deemed um, a threat to human habitation or livestock or so forth, and those that can be helped. And so I really wanted to get my hands dirty and help. And so like the biggest thing may most important may be the smallest when I look at the animals that are helped are sometimes saving one baby bird in the context of the future of this planet might seem like nothing, might seem like a zero-sum game. On the other hand, to that little bird, it's everything. So it kind of comes down to it seems like an awful lot goes into saving one orphaned raccoon. And yet, to that one orphaned raccoon, right, what we're doing is everything. And so my work in how media represent animals other than humans I get to see hands in first person there, kind of what some of that effect is.
There's a line in the, sorry to say, the evil word Amazon Prime TV series Bosch, which is about humans, but where the saying in the Homicide Squad is everyone counts or no one counts.
Indeed. Oh, that's excellent.
I think it really is. And so the point you make about the bird and the raccoon clearly incarnate and perhaps even amplify that excellent expression. So, what I
Excellent.
suggest we do, Prof, if that's okay, is start with the animal activism and scholarship, and then, as the mariners would say, go back, back, back to your earlier work, which was
Yes.
on, or in advertising, but also on questions of, in particular, race and gender, I think it's fair to say. Yeah.
Indeed.
So
Yes.
let's kick off, if we may, with things about our fellow animals, um, your principles, the activist work, as I said, that you do, but also the scholarship you do.
Mhm. I would say the scholarship that I do all draws from the scholarship I did related to human beings in terms of representation, and I say that intentionally. Work of
Mhm.
Stuart Hall, work in semiotics, work of representation as representation is the lens through which I've looked at who's present and who's absent in media and popular culture. And increasingly, that are the perspectives of those who are represented included. And some might say, well, with animals, how are you going to do that? Right? Because they don't have, they don't share it. We know they have a language. We know they communicate. They just don't have ours, which is the one that's privileged, right? Intelligence is privileged in terms of it being human intelligence. But I'd like to see us try to succeed as a rabbit, for example. We wouldn't do very well in the world, or primarily in our sense of smell and so forth. So um, I like to think about just as the way cultural studies would invite us to think of what's present, what's also absent from what we're seeing, what we're reading, what we're hearing. And is there a point of view that should be considered? And Carrie Freeman and I have done a lot of work together as well. I was fortunate to be her dissertation advisor, and then we've continued to go on and do work together. But it was really working with her as a doctoral student in the honor of doing that that I realized I could practice my personal politics in a way in academia, which was as a lifelong vegetarian and then vegan, and not in terms of trying to push that as a way of eating in terms of others, but thinking of it as a way of being in the world that looked at how we treat animals other than humans in a way that considers their interests in addition to ours and acknowledging they have interests in a life.
When,
And yeah,
oh, go ahead.
no, please.
When I taught at the University of California to undergrads who were from working class and, in inverted commas, minority backgrounds,
Yes.
right? They, to a person, sometimes in classes of 300 or 400, would accept, regardless of their own perspectives, debates about issues to do with the representation of people by gender, sexuality, class, religion, and so on, that was legitimate. When it came to animals, and in particular discussions of food and vegetarianism and veganism, I could only describe the response as hysterically negative
Indeed.
and condemnatory. So you could more or less criticize US foreign policy, even though there were lots of soldiers and relatives of soldiers in the class, as long as you were careful and respectful.
Indeed. Yeah.
But mention PETA, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, and there would be a near stampede, if I can use that term. But even mention debates about the unethical treatment of animals in research. Madness ensued. I get the sense from the way you're nodding that perhaps this isn't entirely unfamiliar to you.
It's very familiar. I mean, the dynamics in the classroom, right? The drawing parallels between the treatment of human beings and treatment of animals, or the language we use. I mean, for one thing, and I've certainly written about this, is if the worst thing you can do is refer or treat a human being as an animal, where does that leave animals?
Mm.
But we see that so often, particularly when we're talking about people who have been detained, people who have been rounded up. The languaging in media of particularly people who are brown skinned, people who are othered in other ways, referred to as animalistic. Even in one publication I did, which was about the hunt for Saddam Hussein, which was filled with, and I criticized George W. Bush's speeches on this, is the language was of Saddam Hussein burrowing like an animal through certain areas, the way of trying to hunt down and do that, and the languaging. So, if the worst of the worst human is an animal, where does that leave animals
Mm.
in that way? But yes, in the classroom, absolutely. I was fortunate for a few years to teach a class on animals in the media. I started out communicating nature, and animals would be one portion of that. And then I would look at how media communicate other aspects. And then animals in the media as a class that I created. And I can remember on one day in particular, hadn't hardly started at all, and the class was not, it really, I had nothing in there about food, actually. A young man raised his hand and said, "Is this class going to turn me vegan?"
Mm.
And I stopped for a minute, and it was like, first of all, that was really interesting, but how kind of threatened it felt right away if we were going to dedicate 10 weeks to thinking about portrayals of animals in ads, or the way nature documentaries are created, or why we use animals on greeting cards as stand-ins when we want to make an apology to someone. For example, why do you put a cute kitten or a puppy on something as that foray in? What does it do to us emotionally when we think about it, or we think about films and people wanting to know, but did the dog die before they'll watch it? Um, it's thinking about the psychological process that goes on. But I ran into that all the time, that if we are to create space for critical thought that says, rather than thinking hierarchically, like the great chain of being in Christianity shows, what about if we think a little bit differently about each of our roles or responsibilities? What might we think about the way we've been using animals, or recognize we do use them? But oh, immediately, yes, that was always, I felt like I had to navigate a gentle path in many ways, the same way I did when I was first teaching at University of Oregon. One of the first classes I taught was called um, what was it, gender and media, or media and diversity, something like that. They changed the name, women, minorities, and media. That was the first name. Then they changed it to gender, media, and diversity. And some of the very same things that would come up about race, gender, sexuality would be if someone had an aha moment in
Mm.
terms of not having thought of something in that particular way, how to carefully navigate it so that it wasn't guilt ridden, so that the feelings weren't, you are to blame, but we are all responsible, if that makes sense, from what we do from here on out.
I think this is one of the key issues that we're confronting at the moment with the Trump people and
Mm.
Stephen Miller as some sort of presiding ideologist in all of this. And it is this feeling of guilt or responsibility. I remember when I was perhaps 16 or 17, Susan Brown Miller's Against Our Will was published, which was the first major history of rape in the English language. And the tagline on the back of the paperback that I owned said something like all men are rapists, right?
Mm.
The point being almost all men, almost all the time, benefit from the reality of rape because it suborns women and puts them in positions of unwarranted authority as men, regardless of their merit, and creates a servant class for them. You know the argument perfectly well. But I remember having to get over the fact that when I read this, I'd never had sex, but I also didn't see myself as a rapist, potential or otherwise. You see what I mean? Anyway,
See,
and I went through some sort of internal process to be able to say, that's a provocation. It's an exciting and interesting and quite hurtful one, but it leads you to think very interestingly, very semiotically, in fact, to look at the relations of dependency and interdependency, metonymically, metaphorically, between the concepts on the back of that book, and then to read the history listed in the book or gone into in the book. Do you know what I mean? And I think part of the problem with the awful reaction against issues of diversity and so on that we're experiencing in the US and elsewhere is because the finger wagging scold became an apparent quality of criticisms of gender and racial representation, imperial history, etc. And it's something we need to avoid or at least work with. Do you know what I mean?
yes, yeah. That and what you engaged in with a willingness, certainly probably that feeling, and it is with all of these topics, is the first place many of us go is to react, right?
Mm, mm, mm.
And it's not me or it's not this.
Mhm.
But what you are willing to do, which is what we hope happens in the college classroom or with talking with people who think differently, is that people will stop for a moment and go, well, maybe I need to learn more about this. Maybe I need to understand this more. Or they're not talking about me necessarily personally, but maybe there's something to this. And it's that critical skill, which is what this current administration does not want, which is the attack on education, kill the intellectuals, as it will be, that we've seen in many other historical times. And to get at, which connects kind of all of this that we're talking about, or that provocation on the book, which is rape isn't about sex, it's about power. And that began to become part of the discussion thereafter, after that came out, which was thinking about it. Let's remove it from this sense of it being about sex, and it's about power, domination, and patriarchy, and that it operates at a different level that way. And I look at the same way female animals are treated in the system of production. Although male animals don't work out much better, it's the reproductive abilities of female animals and what they produce from their bodies. That's often what it is, the system that is exerting power over them wants: the eggs, the milk, the kind of their babies that wants produced there. And these are, although there's some pretty violent acts against their bodies, they are about their production of that as a natural, normal role and function. And there's actually, now that I'm talking about it, there's like creepy parallels between the ideology that wants to be dominant now in the culture about what women's roles should be, and about fears about the population going down in the United States or in the planet. And on the one hand, for me, I'm like, I certainly hope so. We've maxed out the planet's carrying capacity. We overconsume, and there's too many people. And so, but that's definitely a threat to the system where true believers in that extreme right wing want women having as many children as they can, want to get rid of reproductive freedom. And it's part of their narrative, right? The ones that you taught, it's about power and control.
And this makes me think of the wonderful website that you and I think a colleague have created about how to represent animals. This is animalsandmedia.org. I think that's what it's called.
That is
And
it.
I'm going to put a link to that as well as to your U of O webpage when we publish this. But I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about what you're seeking to do with that website and what needs doing in this regard.
Oh, thank you. Yes. And it is Dr. Carrie Freeman. That is, we worked with this together. Her background has been in farmed animals and the way news media represent them in particular. And then she's gone on to do more of that work. But the idea for that came about after my years of of offering classes, teaching classes on responsible and respectful representation of various marginalized groups and human groups,
Hmm.
many of which had created their own style guides as alternatives or addendums to the AP style book, right? For say for words, for language. And I saw that across many groups. GLAAD, which GLAAD, which gay, lesbian, they've changed their name a little bit, had a really strong rep website, Native and all the Native American journalists, Asian American, Black journalists, all created style guides to say, here are respectful, accurate, more accurate words to use, ways of portraying, so forth. And one of the edicts of the Society of Professional Journalists is to provide voice for the voiceless. That's a tenet that's in those guides that are there. And on the one hand, it can sound a little minimizing, but the whole idea is one of the main goals, say, of photojournalism, of traditional journalism, would be to seek out not those who are your typical, when we used to have Rolodexes, but in your like list there, but who's missing, whose faces, whose voices, do they need an interpreter? Is it a matter of language? Is it social class? What's the barrier here
Yeah. Yeah.
to being having voice? And for me, it was one of the biggest groups who had none of that were animals other than humans. And a lot of examples of using animals in ways as symbolic stand-ins for humans. Not that there was anything wrong with that, and alluding to, my background in advertising, in the advertising profession, we frequently use animals to stand in for our emotions or our ways of being, or, in 30 seconds or in one page and that. But what about the real animals in the world was a question I had, and some gross misrepresentations in Disney films and other places of animal experiences and inaccuracies. So it was this web page was an example of also providing that, building on other groups' work. And we've been trying with the Associated Press, that's kind of lapsed now on the many, many efforts there to get the AP style guide to not refer to animals as it, the
Hmm.
pronoun use that would be saying, and some groups, the Guardian and others have just said, this is how we're going to do it, is if you know the biological sex of the animal as assigned, then say that. Don't say the cow it, say the cow she, or the cow he. And if you don't, use they. Now, that hasn't progressed as far as human language and pronouns, but it's a big step from an it, which is easier to treat as nothing, as an object, than it is if you know that cow is female or that sheep is male.
I guess one of the things here too is that in terms of representation, not so much in the sense of the indexical mirroring or incarnation of all of us as creatures, but also who gets to speak. There is the issue of
Hmm.
how the interests of other animals can be expressed and made legible democratically, because
Mhm.
otherwise they have no voice in apparently democratically taken decisions that have huge effects on their lives.
Indeed. right? Think about simple things like urban development and planning cities or planning where we are going to put our houses or something. And I remember I was in one house that had been built and the deer kept showing up and standing around and looking in kind of different ways after that construction. And then I went out and looked around and I could see the trail that they had used maybe for centuries as a species came up to the house, ended, and then started again on the other side of the house. But the house had been put exactly in their migratory pattern.
Mm, mm,
And that made me kind of think about, well, there was the human interest in expanding an urban growth boundary. There was all this human interest going on, but should we also think about animals on the landscape who also have a right to a life?
mm,
And um, so it, or being allies. I think that's one of the things too to talk about is we do
mhm,
this with our own species. If someone is unable to speak, doesn't speak the same language, we provide translators. Or maybe for children, we provide someone who can help them access and represent their thoughts, not as a disability, but rather this is a skill that we provide. And so can say, well, I don't bark and I don't, we try to get dolphins to understand our language, but do we try to understand their language? And in this way, allies, biologists who understand them best, for example, might have some insight into the need of the animal. Other people who even saying it's kind of interesting, Carrie had mentioned this, even talking to vegans, ethical vegans about what they think about it, because we don't have a commercial economic interest in continuing to treat animals in the way they've been treated, rather to say, well, is it necessary to, grow all these particular passive cows in order to make them um, agreeable when we want to kill them for their bodies and stuff like that. Um, could be to do that, but at least find someone who might be able to bring another perspective to it, even though the rabbit can't, necessarily offer what they need. To recognize they do have an interest in a
Frederick,
life, in a family, in reproducing. Yeah.
Frederick Wiseman, as you know, is director of dozens of wonderful institutional critiques of US life. He wouldn't call them critiques, but they are. And one of the ways he gets around accusations of being on the left is this. In the case of his film Meat, which I think was in the early 80s, when he was criticized by PBS viewers or PBS critics or whatever, pushing a line against the treatment of animals in industrial farming forms, he said, no, not at all. Every night that I made the film, I ate a steak, sometimes someone I'd met earlier in the day. And it's sort of a gruesome thing to say, but I think it's a very, very powerful point.
Indeed, using that someone, right? Right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about a number of your recent publications, which appear, at least the ones that I was able to get hold of, which appear in Animal Sentience. Can you tell us about animal sentience and some of the things you've been writing about there? Animal sentience as an outlet, as a place.
As a place, or thinking about the coyote paper. Is that
That's
one that
that's one, for example.
that's
Yes.
one of them in there? Yeah. That is an example of one of the things that I wanted to learn more about and why I situated myself in Central Oregon was that particular publication was related to coyotes, although applies to many other fur-bearing animals in that way. But the political dimensions of this, along with the animal dimensions, having to do with who becomes otherized as a species.
Mm,
And in the wildlife hospital, for example, there are designated species we can't help if they have orphaned offspring. For example, wolves, bears, coyotes, or cougars. Even though they're native on the landscape, the interests of rural landowners are so strong that the wildlife rescues and rehabs are prohibited from helping those species. Even though they are charismatic megafauna, they represent an perceived economic
Mm,
threat.
mm,
The data is
mm.
not there to support that, but the
The
word of mouth
lobby
that's
is. It's a
it
big
is.
issue here in Mexico with what in English we call jaguars, jaguar, no?
Mhm.
Who are native really everywhere in Mexico, including north central, as it's called, where I am now. And they were being decimated by
Yes,
two elements you've touched on already. One, human inhabitants, but two, cattle farmers, where what matters is that they should slaughter cattle in their way, having moved the cattle into the habitat of the jaguar, and not have those cattle slaughtered by the jaguar, who are carnivores and like to eat things they can eat, right?
indeed, right. And might only take one or two. And the only reason they're taking them, in fact, is they've lost so much habitat
Of course.
that there's reasons to be coming in to do that. And the same with this here with coyote or coyote
Mm.
in this way on the landscape. They are so they can be hunted any day of the year. You can kill them anytime you want, coyotes out here, even though they do extremely important work in terms of, so you see that, and then you see all these people putting these rodent killing boxes out and hiring pest services because of the bushy-tailed wood rats, otherwise known as pack rats, who are also demonized out here. Well, if you left the coyotes alone, that's one of who they eat them and they do that. But and a coyote cannot take down a 700-pound cow. But the perception is that that they can, that they're a threat on the landscape to the very operations that you're talking to. But what I learned about, and I wanted to learn to find out more about rural versus urban, which is believed to be in great conflict here. And I read a fascinating book on the rural urban politics, was the wildlife killing contests. In the United States, only 7 states ban these contests that individuals can go out, and on this particular time, there are great prizes offered for how many you can kill in as short a time as you can and pile up the bodies. Only 7 U.S. states prohibit it, and the you can kill who's ever determined to be a problematic animal, any of these animals, any time of the year. But this one time of year, it's this holiday that takes place in Oregon, at kind of eastern Oregon, central Oregon. And defenders of it say it's a bonding activity between father and son. It's a way of pest control on the landscape, but it defies all the science that says with coyotes, if you start killing them in this way en masse, they actually have larger litters and more litters. That's their stress response, is to actually produce more pups. But the commitment to this as an activity is so strong. So 4 times, um, yeah, 4 times now in total, um, a bill to end the contest, not end the killing of the animal, but end the contest, has gone to the Oregon State Legislature. And in um, 2 of the times, the Republican senators staged a walkout. And right before that bill got its hearing on the floor, the final time, and some of them can't rerun for office. So fortunately, there were a few consequences there. But on the environmental bill, the Republicans staged this walkout and then ran the clock down on this. So finally, it went to the State Fish and Wildlife, and there was small success of preventing killing en masse on public lands, because the land surrounding where I live is all called Bureau of Land Management, and it's all federal land, but lots of things happen on it. what I was interested in getting to my research is the testimonies of both people who supported a bill to ban wildlife killing contests in Oregon and people who did not want to see those contests banned. What were they saying? What were their defenses? What kinds of testimonies, both, and this was during the time when almost everything was happening on Zoom or in writing during the pandemic. So you can, for all these bills, submit written testimony or oral testimony. And so analyzing all that, what were the themes on both sides for their defending? And what were people saying about the reasons they felt that should be maintained? And I found some of the most powerful ones actually came from several generational farmers who said, look, the animals I raise are my responsibility. And if I send them out on this Bureau of Land Management land out of my supervision, I'm responsible for what happens to them, not the wildlife who live out there. And or ethical hunters, so-called, right? Who were saying this, piling them up and killing as many as you can and giving prizes for the biggest one or the smallest one, um, is not ethical hunting. That is not how it's done. And of course, I wouldn't have non-subsistence hunting happen no matter. But in this case, those were powerful arguments. And it was the hunter one that actually convinced some of the state to say, okay, at least on public land. But these contests are taking place on private land. But the nature of the arguments made were full of psychological projection for wanting to keep the contests, because if you regulate hunting of any kind, you're on your way to getting rid of the Second Amendment and you'll take away my gun rights. That was one of the biggest arguments is if you're going to tell me who I can kill and when I can kill them, next step will be you'll take away my gun. And that persisted.
I remember the tragedy in 2009 when Taylor Mitchell died, this young singer who was killed, it seems, or I think certain, by coyote, no? And
Hmm.
obviously that was a tragedy, a terrible experience, like a couple of people known to me who were killed by mountain lions, right? My anxiety about the way in which those sorts of stories are represented and highlighted is that they don't talk about, as you were saying, moving onto the natural terrain of these folks and functioning in a way that doesn't acknowledge how they function. Because, of course, that's exactly why people don't want to have foxes in their backyards.
Yes. Yes, they're going to steal their babies and
Exactly.
all those rumors. But yeah, I see that regularly reported here, although the information is way off and it's often a different species, but cougars in particular out here, where there'll be all of this reactionary media coverage where, and it's just a cougar passing through, right, on their way somewhere else, or there've been a couple of wolf packs are in the area in terms of some wolf recovery.
Mm.
And they are just passing through a landscape that a few years ago didn't have that development on it, right? That
Mm.
housing
Mhm.
development or whatever, but the urban growth boundaries spread. These animals for thousands of years probably have been passing through on their way to something else as the seasons change. But the reactionary media coverage is cougar sighted near school, right?
Yeah, complete
And
hysteria.
yeah, it's completely reactionary, and the animal usually ends up losing in any case um, because of that. Instead of going, well, what would the natural behavior of this animal be? Let's step back, take a moment, and not be boarding ourselves up in our houses because, a puma has crossed the road.
And
And
this is interesting again in terms of the metaphorical redeployment of the term cougar towards women. The cougar in the United
haha,
States being the somewhat older woman engaged in a sexual interest or activity with younger men, right? I think that's the definition.
pretty much in that. And you think it's a woman who's got to be like 40s older. She's predatory, and there's with that she there's a note of desperation. And as a side thing, I just happen to think, because I also in that have looked at animal prints in fashion, right? And fashion advertising and the rise of wearing all that like leopard print and women wearing all of that type of thing is casting that sort of feral feminine in there as someone who's going to pounce on you, is going to take advantage of you being, it's very heteronormative narrative that's in that as well, to saying who she's going to go after, and she's going to hunt, and she's going to take the unwilling.
Hmm.
And it's a way of marginalizing women, particularly older women, who already are becoming invisible in the dominant narrative.
Picking up from that theme, could we go back to your earlier work on gender and representation and also a bit to your life in advertising? Could you share with us a little bit about that?
Yes, I actually professionally worked in advertising after, and this was in Florida, in the Tampa Bay area of Florida. And after undergraduate in that, I worked in the advertising industry. And going along in that, it was partly of what drove me to want to go on and get more education, was really understanding not only the demographics, the measurable statistics about people, places, and things that we were aiming messages toward, but the psychological process of engaging in message creation and targeting. And I remember in particular working for the agency that launched the Florida Lottery. And there was a long history of La Loteria in Miami and Tampa, and the process of gaming and doing all that. And but one question that came up was, were the messages being targeted into areas where people could least afford to be spending money on lottery tickets? And things like that began to concern me. And even New York Lottery had to stop a campaign that said for $1 and a dream, because for some people that was their last dollar. And yet the campaign built on that. So my questions came in about, what are we doing? Who is responding? Should we be doing? And what should we, on that? And so I wanted to study the
Hmm.
psychological aspects of message creation and reception more. And that's what took me on for ending that, and feeling like understood a bit more about how ads are created, why they're created, um, and what the effects can be they can have on that. And that's what I followed up with in academia. So it was primarily relying on visual media in that
Wow. So you
analysis.
came from the field, from the industry itself, back into
Yes.
research to understand what, in a sense, you'd been doing in part. Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly, because anything of the research in the industry was just all directed towards selling more, getting the client to sign off on whatever it was that was there. And it was like, yeah, but there's a lot more to this than we're seeing in a hyper consumerist Stuart Ewan kind of way of looking at
Yeah, sure.
um, what was
And
happening.
gender is obviously one of the key elements in advertising, as is race, as is class, but perhaps less obviously. Could you tell us a little bit about what became your interests in those questions as time went on?
Yeah, this is really interesting, I think, too. Well, being born female in this culture, in this society, and understanding something about those roles, I think I personally understood the effects of the issues of body image and appearance, and
Mm.
what I was receiving as an individual woman in the culture. And also, I appreciate your use of the term gender, and I get really irritated. At least this is how I've always understood the difference between sex and gender. And I feel that the word gender gets completely misused.
Mm,
in media and in the press in terms of that's being, as someone once said, that's what's between our ears.
mm,
And so what's between our ears is largely influenced by mass media and campaigns and social pressure. So what does it mean to be feminine? What does it mean to be masculine? Why are those categories so narrowly defined? So my original work started out having to do with how body image is communicated, ideal body image, particularly for women in the culture. And I was a real, which I still am kind of a workout fanatic, but what were the messages I was internalizing? And then I began to see that in the culture of how I was expected to be female
mm, mhm,
and asking why. Why was that the only way to be female, or particularly about unrealistic thin body ideals? And how can someone be strong and fight? And originally, although she's Naomi Wolf has gone off into some other areas, her first book, oh gosh, I'm trying to think,
Beauty
was it
myth.
I'm sorry,
Beauty myth?
The Beauty Myth, was so powerful in that it was talking about how can we as women who are taught this dominant narrative, who are too hungry from dieting, too broke from having to pay extra for just about everything, including things like makeup and certain kinds of clothes. So we're too broke, hungry, and tired to compete for the really important jobs that are out there or to do the work. And that stuck with me. It stuck with a lot of young women. In terms of being able to ask those questions. Now, it was funny in the teaching atmosphere. If you had a bunch of young women together, they were all on board with that. They totally down with it and they got it. And then, but if there were some guys in the room, all of a sudden they started to defer to them, or well, maybe that was what some girls heard, but not others. And the dynamics in that would rapidly shift because as a bunch of young undergraduates, they're all posturing for one another in terms of likability and so forth. And but when you got girls on their own, um, they would often talk in that way about it. But it was also very marginalizing for individuals who did not see themselves as one or the other to find a voice in
mm.
that narrative. And so that was kind of the route, starting with that, starting of working in advertising, thinking about the effects the ads were having, why were they targeted in the way, and in particular, what messages of gender and appearance were being communicated. Now, this is talking about the early 90s when I was in that place and starting to ask those questions about it. So even one of my first studies was in a health club, participant observation in an athletic club about these ideas. So yeah.
And Prof. Deb, I've got one more question for you, if I may, after which I'd like to invite you to add anything you wish. And that could
Okay.
take the form of revisiting material we've already discussed, or it might be something entirely new. Does that sound okay as a means of bringing things to a conclusion?
Sounds perfect. Thank you, Toby.
So my last query directly to you is if you could take us through, adumbrate for us a little bit, your monographs, because you've produced, I think, three significant research books. Yeah.
Just my fourth just came out this
Oh,
year.
sorry. Well,
No,
let's start with number four. Let's do the promotion. In fact, have you got a copy you could hold up for me to see for some product placement?
uh, should I do that now and
Please
just
do. Yes, I'd love to see it, even though the listeners won't. The prof's just wandered off into her mythic background, and I now see there's a second horse which had been
there
blocked from
is.
my vision. But she's back now. She's
And
returned
there
to
is
the.
a diversion. It is a diversion, and yet it's not. Okay, wait a minute, because there's that background. Is this going to work?
I can see the word Freud, I can see the word Sigmund, and I can see a critical introduction to media and communication theory. Wow.
Indeed.
So take us through young Sigmund.
Yeah. So this one is kind of a departure because I do want to say when my third book that focused on the representation of animals in
Mm,
media and popular culture, I felt was really bringing forth some other work, but there is a through line to all of this. So um, I while I was an associate professor, I was working on a second PhD in a graduate institute called Pacifica Graduate Institute, which is located in Santa Barbara, and its focus is on mythology, world mythology, Joseph Campbell's work. It's focused on the work of Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung. And Jung in particular is all about images, but so is Freud. And if you look back on the work that I've done, it's all been about the psychological processes of how we come to know what we think we know about someone or something. And I would often say when we're talking about a group of humans, but this applies to animals other than humans, if to someone, if the only way you know that person, place, or thing is the way the media have presented them, what do you think you know?
mm, mm,
So it might be a race issue, it might be a sexuality portrayal. Well, the only way I've met someone who's Asian is based on this one TV show or based on this whatever. So what do you think you know about them or this animal or this whatever? So the process of stereotyping has been central, the psychological process of drawing these generalizations, often not based on personal experience. And so I wanted to understand at least one perspective on where this comes from. So my first book was a reflection of couple decades of teaching about gender, media, and diversity
mm.
amongst humans. Then I focused on sex in the media because I taught a class on how sex and sexuality are represented and what we learn. Then I moved on to animals other than humans, their portrayals. And then Peter Lang, who I've been publishing with over the years, had a specific series on various theorists and how we could relate them to media theory. Stuart Walter Lippmann, for one, Bell Hooks was one, and I was doing this additional doctoral work in depth, what's called depth psychology, not death, but depth. The depth of the unconscious mind is where that's at. Well, the originator of that thought was Sigmund Freud. And my question was, and I got really interested because Freud's actually was a really good writer and he was kind of funny if you actually read the stuff. But Freud is not taught in psychology programs. You will almost never find a class on Freud, even though many of the ideas get used. So I wanted to go back and unpack what were some of the main theories of Freud's, how have they been used, and then how can we as media scholars, use some of these ideas to not only understand ourselves as individuals, but understand collective behavior. So that's what the book does. It goes through chapter by chapter of what were the main theories. I'll just have to glance at the table of contents again to do that.
Mhm.
How have Freud's theories been used in media, primarily cinema studies? Is where you will find a lot of that, particularly unpacking the use of dreams or dream series or psychoanalytic thought. And it's also a great place to look at feminist pushback on the use of Freudian theory because there's significant literature on that. And then I looked at what would a study look like today using Freud. So I take a look at fashion advertising, for example, to see do we see, and so I take a dominant fashion campaign that has, well, psychoanalysis and the arts, but a fashion campaign that you can unpack using Freud to do that. Then I take a look at, in particular, I looked at, which is kind of timely in there, well, in the cinema one, I looked at the film Melancholia, and I highly recommend watching that film to get a sense of what the idea of melancholy is and the psychological state. But it's a really amazing film. And then I took a look at Donald Trump's first campaign through a public relations lens. Why do true believers tend to come to where they do on what techniques? And as an aside, we always hear in our field about the fathers of advertising or the fathers of this, fathers of that, even though the mothers were there. Well, the father of public relations is Edward Bernays, who was Freud's nephew.
Mm-hmm.
So I bring that context to public relations and then some of the strategies to create and generate kind of the mentality, the victimization mentality, and so forth, used throughout Trump's narratives, Trump's campaign, Trump's way of talking to his public, and where that comes from, but also to understand him a bit. And so that's what my latest book that came out um, back last fall talks about in that way is that. But the through line then, I mean, Freud and sex, right? And books on sex and advertising and how sex is used. But we know if sex is used to sell, if it's too sexy, people don't remember the product. And so it can backfire too. So there, it's all about how essentially we as human beings create the group, which is us, and then project to create who is them and for what reasons. Sometimes we want to eat them if they're cows or sheep or chickens or ducks or whatever. Sometimes the we is someone who wants to kill another group of people. So how do you construct them to be an it? And uh, and what some theories are on that and how we in media studies can use them.
Wow, it sounds fantastic. I apologize for not having familiarized myself with it. So, Prof, to conclude, are there things you'd like to add? And as I said earlier, they might be matters we've touched on, or they might be entirely new topics.
Well, I've certainly gone, every question you've asked, I've kind of gone on for a long answer here. I would think I would just have to say that as an aside to all of this, for me, a motivation, and I invite others in that one way I've survived academia, I'm surviving in life, is I'm also a yoga teacher. And one of the main tenets of that is empathy
Mm.
and do no harm. And I feel like that's motivated my life, my research in the best ways I can. No one is above doing things, and we certainly don't all, there's no being pure at any of this that we do, but it's about intention. And I feel like taking that moment to pause, like you did when you read that back of that book, is even if it activated something, boy, it activated something. That means there's something for me to do here. There's something for me to learn here. Even if I come back to the way I originally felt, at least I learned. I asked some questions and I leaned into it. And to me, that's the most important part is not coming down to where I do or somebody else does on any of these topics, but is how right now, more than ever, especially in the United States, but no doubt elsewhere, is to hold on to keep asking those questions, to keeping that critical ability going and to push back whenever we can.
Beautifully put. Thank you so much, Prof. Deb. It's been wonderful having the chance to talk to you. I've learned a lot from your work in the past and perhaps even more today.
Oh, indeed, it's been such an honor. Thank you so much.